Welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to go over everything you need to know about playing Discipline Priest in the Shadowlands pre-patch. While Disc Priest didn't get an entire rework like Shadow, we still got a number of changes that significantly affect the spec. Whether you're new to Discipline or a returning veteran, pre-patch is a good time to test everything out, have some fun, and prepare yourself for the upcoming expansion. I'll be going over spells, talents, Azerite Essences, and how these changes affect our playstyle in Mythic Plus. I've also been getting a lot of questions from some of you who are returning to the game after a long hiatus or switching to Discipline for the first time. So I'll also give you my recommendations on what to use if you're a little light on the essences and gear. First, let's take a very quick look at how the Discipline Priest functions in dungeons and the decision making involved to maximize the effectiveness of the spec. The primary and preferred way to heal your teammates is via Atonement, a buff you apply by casting Shadow Mend, Power Word Shield, or Power Word Radiance. When I say preferred method, what I mean is Atonement is the most efficient way to heal. Spells that apply Atonement are expensive, but DPS spells that trigger Atonement healing are relatively cheap. Healing through Atonement is also the best way to contribute a meaningful amount of DPS to your team's overall damage to speed up the dungeon. However, the damage patterns in dungeons don't always play nice with your desire to only heal through Atonement. Atonement is great for throughput healing, but not always the best option if one party member needs a lot of focused healing. In dungeons, your job above all else is to keep your team alive, and sometimes that means taking talents, essences, or Azerite traits that boost your single target throughput. Remember, you prefer to heal via Atonement, but don't hesitate to switch to Shadow Mend spam or aggressively burning your defensive cooldowns to keep the pull on track. Many people say Disc is bad at catching up, but it's more that it's bad at catching up efficiently. Shadow Mend can top people off, but if you have to resort to spamming Shadow Mend on everyone in your party, you're going to find yourself out of mana very quickly. To prevent yourself from falling behind, aggressively apply Atonement and DPS hard to keep people healthy. I'll be covering more advanced playstyle tips and some common mistakes Disc players make at the end of this video, but first, I want to cover the changes to the spec and how these changes affect our decision making. Let's talk about our new spells, Mind Blast, Mind Seer, and Shadow Word Death. Mind Blast is a high damage spell with a fairly expensive mana cost. It may not always be the best idea to keep it on cooldown for long, drawn-out fights where you'll be tight on mana, but it's great for pumping out DPS and keys, especially when paired with Schism. While this spell does come with a hefty mana cost, it's actually one of your most mana-efficient spells if you only have one Atonement out on the tank due to its large static absorb component. If your group is taking light damage and you're looking to maximize your DPS on shorter fights, keep Mind Blast on cooldown, ideally casting it inside of a Schism window if that's available to you. Keep in mind, Sins of the Many has no damage falloff for the first Atonement target, so there's never any reason to not have Atonement on at least one person, even if it feels like there's no damage going out. Mind Seer is a welcome addition to our AoE kit. It packs a big DPS punch on large pulls with the added benefit of being usable at range, unlike our Holy Nova. One thing to note about Holy Nova during pre-patch is we don't have access to rank 2, which triggers a second Holy Nova at half strength if we hit 3 or more targets. Rank 2 Holy Nova will make it competitive with Mind Seer and Shadowlands, but for now, I'd recommend sticking with Mind Seer unless your group is tightly stacked and you're trying to also get extra direct healing. Keep in mind, both Mind Seer and Holy Nova only trigger Atonement once per cast on the first mob they hit. Mind Seer isn't a very mana efficient spell in terms of healing, but will dish out the most damage on large pulls if you can afford to channel it instead of using more impactful healing spells. Don't forget to apply Purge the Wicked to all targets that will live for the full duration of the dot before switching to Mind Seer, since Purge the Wicked will give you a lot more passive Atonement healing and can put in some meaningful damage on high health targets. The last new spell is Shadow Word Death. This spell doesn't trigger Atonement, but is still a very high DPS global against any mob below 20% health. Just be careful you don't overlap the reflect damage with a dangerous boss mechanic, as this could result in a very tragic outcome. One thing to note, Shadow Word Death is able to consume up to 50% of your total health, so be careful. Along with the new spells, several spells receive changes going into pre-patch. The biggest change is Rapture now immediately applies a shield to your target when cast, so however you manage your targeted healing spells, whether that's mouse over macros or through an add-on, make sure you update Rapture. This buff to Rapture is a lifesaver in keys when using it as a reactive defensive cooldown. However, the duration of Rapture was reduced from 10 to 8 seconds. In dungeons, I rarely need the full 10-second duration, and by the time we set foot into the raid in Shadowlands, we'll have a potency conduit that extends Rapture back to its 10-second duration. So overall, I don't think this nerf is that impactful. Minor note here, but Fade now reduces the range at which mobs can detect you, which could help you out a bit on some of those tight skips. For talents, a few changes here as well. Schism was nerfed from 40% increased damage to 25% increased damage, which I don't think will dramatically change when you pick it. It's still the best talent for ramping in Raid, and you'll still want to take Twisted Fate and Keys anytime you expect to be doing a lot of triage healing. In the level 30 talent row, Power Word Solace's base cooldown was increased from 10 to 15 seconds. This is reduced by haste, so it might still be fine for pre-patch if you prefer the playstyle, but this nerf has made Mindbender a more attractive option. Shadow Covenant received a dramatic rework and now increases all damage and healing for 9 seconds after you cast it. The drawback is you can only cast shadow spells for those 9 seconds. I've been steering clear of this talent, but I think it could have some uses. If you plan to use it offensively, you quickly run out of offensive shadow spells to cast. I think Sins of the Many is an overall better pick for the offensive use case. However, I do think there's a potential niche use case selecting this as a very conservative, reactionary defensive pick, where you use Shadow Covenant for a large AoE heal, then spam single target Shadow Mends with 25% increased effectiveness. I can't say that I recommend playing it this way, or that I've identified any specific situations where this would be good, but it's worth noting that it's a possibility. If any of you have situations where you like taking Shadow Covenant, let me know in the comments below. I still take Sins of the Many in this row because I think it's an all-around better pick with the added benefit of not requiring an extra keybind. Finally, in the level 50 talent row, after much iteration on Blizzard's part, Spirit Shell is now the only change. As fun as Spirit Shell looks, it replaces Rapture and doesn't allow you to pick up Lenience. I think there's room to innovate with Spirit Shell, and we'll probably see some people taking it and using it in cool ways, but Lenience is looking like a safer pick in Mythic Plus. I think Spirit Shell could potentially be a good pickup for something like Kragmaw in Underrot. As far as Azerite is concerned, Art of Darkness and Death Throes were always good, but are now even better after the level squish. Death Throes does in fact work with Discipline, but you have to swap to Shadow to select the Azerite trait. Generic stat traits, Depth of Shadows, and Enduring Luminescence are also decent pickups to fill in your remaining slots. Now, let's talk about essences. I get a lot of questions about essences, so I hope my explanation here does the topic some justice. First and foremost, use the essences that you're comfortable with and keep experimenting with different combinations to find what works best for you. I know many of you are just coming back to the game or picking up Priest for the first time, so you might not have all the essences on this list. That's totally fine. I'll go over my thought process when I'm picking up essences, which should hopefully help you pick up yours, even if you don't have the exact same essences as me. And if you're unsure, please don't hesitate to reach out to me in the comments below, in my Discord, or while I'm streaming on YouTube. I've played with all the essences over the course of the expansion. I swap them out constantly depending on who I'm playing with, the weekly affixes, the key level, and the dungeon. The most important question to ask yourself when picking your essences and talents is how much healing throughput do I need for this dungeon? If I'm ever unsure, I go with the more conservative, defensive lineup that will allow me to recover from bad situations. Remember, your primary goal is always to keep your team alive. Then, as I get comfortable healing certain content, I dial up the aggression by dropping defensive talents and essences for more DPS. Sometimes I go a little too far and don't feel like I have the right amount of healing power for a specific dungeon, or I run out of mana on a long fight and have to reassess my lineup. Again, I'm sharing my experiences and what I've found to work and not work with respect to talents and essences. But don't take my word for it. Test these out for yourself and see what works best for you and your playstyle. That being said, let's get into it. I pretty much always take Conflict and Strife and Vitality Conduit Miners. Conflict and Strife is a great versatility buff that increases damage, healing, and reduces damage taken. And Vitality Conduit does a great job shoring up the single target healing weakness that Discipline has by constantly pumping health into the targets that need it. One notable exception is I usually move Vitality Conduit to my major slot during Necrotic Week, since Vitality Conduit is completely unaffected by the Necrotic affix. The tank has 99 stacks of Necrotic, no problem, pop Vitality Conduit while they realize the error of their ways, or life grip them if they don't. If I'm going into a dungeon with very long fights on a Tyrannical week, or if I have to hit some very high HPS checks, I might take Lucid Dreams Major and slot in Ever-Rising Tide Minor. Lucid Dream's active and passive abilities give you mana back, and you get a huge amount of leech when you pop the major effect. This leech allows you to largely ignore your own health during heavy damage phases and focus on healing your teammates. If it's not a healing intensive dungeon, I'll take Crucible of Flame Major. Crucible was always a good pick, but it's even stronger now in pre-patch. Keep in mind, this is pretty much a pure DPS essence, but it's a lot of damage. There is a minor healing effect, but it's not much. Crucible has 3 separate damage components that you'll see in the meters. The direct damage from the major effect, the damage over time from the major effect, and the damage over time from the passive proc. When using Crucible, keep in mind that the dot from the on-use major effect doesn't stack, so it's best to not cast your 2 charges back to back on the same target, but instead wait for the first dot to finish before casting your second charge. Back when we needed to take an 8.3 essence for the 10 corruption resistance, I always took Spirit of Preservation Minor. This is another essence that can help you catch up. If you're good about not overusing Shadow Mend, Spirit of Preservation in combination with Depth of Shadows really makes your Shadow Mends count when you need them most. However, I think the Formless Void is also a great choice. I've recently been using Formless Void Minor instead of Spirit of Preservation when I don't think I'll need the extra Shadow Mend healing. The DPS combo of using Crucible to proc the Intellect and Haste, then Schism, Mind Blast, and a Power of the Dark Side Penance is a lot of burst DPS and healing. Formless Void is also a better pickup since the value of Intellect skyrocketed in pre-patch. If you don't have all of these essences, Well of Existence can be a good minor pickup, but it alters your playstyle a bit. You'll most likely want to use more Power Word Radiance charges when people are topped off so your well has stored healing for when you need it most. Well of Existence is great for bursting week, but be careful using it on Grievous or Tyrannical weeks as it quickly depletes when you're under stress, and once it's depleted, it essentially becomes worthless. Lifebinder's Invocation can also be a decent major for dungeons. Popping it to get ready for heavy bursting or to power through Grievous or any other heavy damage phase is a valid strategy, even if it runs a bit against the natural playstyle of Discipline. I hope that explanation provided some insight into how I pick my essences before each dungeon. Plan to bring enough healing for the dungeon, then squeeze out as much DPS as you can. Keep experimenting and ultimately play with the essences that work best for you. Speaking of DPS, let's talk a bit about how to play in dungeons and how to meet the healing checks while contributing as much DPS as you can. When it comes to Mythic Plus, don't ever forget that the most important objective is minimizing time. People sometimes get caught up in the damage meters and the overall DPS, and forget that none of that matters if you don't time the dungeon. As a healer, clearly the best way you can speed up the dungeon is by not allowing people to die. A death costs you 5 seconds on the timer, reduces your DPS on the current pull, and usually requires you to waste more time either rezzing that person or waiting for them to run back. That may seem obvious, but it's a subtle distinction. Your job isn't to heal, it's to do everything you can to speed up the dungeon as much as you can, and one component of that is to heal enough to not let people die. When I'm DPSing as a healer, I'm usually putting most of my effort into the highest health mob, even if it means doing less overall damage. For example, if your tank pulls 5 mobs and 4 of them have 20,000 health and one of them has 150,000 health, I usually won't even waste globals dotting the smaller mobs and instead just put everything I have into the highest health mob. Although this means I do less damage overall, the high health mob will die faster and the overall pull will take less time. I really wish a lot more DPS realized this too, but the desire to top the DPS meters is an enticing drug that I definitely fall victim to on occasion as well. This effect gets even worse on Bolstering Week, where you might finish a pull with massive damage numbers, but not being careful with AoE damage literally created larger health pools out of thin air and extended the duration of the pull by a significant amount of time. Also, on Sanguine Week, using Shining Force to avoid mobs healing can also speed up pulls when things go wrong. Just make sure you aren't accidentally knocking another mob into a Sanguine pool. Being able to even out health pools requires a UI that displays this information. If you run Plater and have any interest in my profile, you can grab it from my Discord as well as my LVUI profile and every weaker I use. I know this was a bit of a rant, but I think it's critical to mention that as a healer, your job isn't just to heal, it's to do everything in your power to time the key. So how do you keep people alive while maximizing your DPS? This, my friends, is why I love playing a Discipline Priest. On pull, always make sure your tank has Atonement, and try to cast it on them right before they pull so you don't get aggro. However, since we have Fade, it's pretty easy to handle threat at the start of a pull. I frequently fade right on pull so I can get as many dots out as I can. Your Purge the Wicked dots serve as the backbone of your throughput healing, especially if you have any Death Throes traits. As the pull progresses and requires more healing, you might have to transition to more aggressive spot healing. That spot healing is much more effective when it's supplemented by a bunch of dots healing everyone with Atonement. Since Penance spreads your dot, always cast Penance on a mob with Purge the Wicked already active to get a free spread without costing a global. One common mistake people make is letting their dots fall off and not reapplying Purge the Wicked mid-pull. This significantly hurts your healing throughput and DPS. Micromanaging your dots is very important for a Disc Priest. In fact, if I don't think I'll need pain suppression in the next 3 minutes, I'll sometimes use it on pull so I get a free 8 seconds of applying dots and DPSing before I have to worry about the tank. This speeds the pull up and gets my dot healing engine going. If you're new to the spec, one trick I recommend is get in the habit of applying Purge the Wicked before you cast Penance when it comes off cooldown. This way, you'll at least be putting up 2 dots every time you cast Penance. Speaking of cooldowns, one mistake I sometimes see people making is not being aggressive with their cooldowns. In the example I used above, I'm much more likely to use my pain suppression aggressively to increase my DPS if I know I won't be needing it soon, and if I know my Rapture and Barrier are both off cooldown. If pain suppression is my only defensive off cooldown, I'll probably be a bit more conservative with its use. However, there's a fine line between using your cooldowns proactively and wasting your cooldowns. You want to get use out of them to maximize their value while also making sure you have an emergency button for those extra spicy pulls. The last big mistake I see people making as Disc is playing too reactively. The longer you can stay ahead of the damage, the longer you can heal via Atonement instead of having to spot heal your party members. If my group is going into a pull where I expect a lot of immediate party-wide damage, I might cast Mindbender and Radiance on pull to make sure I've got constant healing on everyone, so as the damage comes out, I'm staying ahead of it instead of waiting until people start taking damage. Once the Mindbender fades, I might pop a barrier and continue aggressively DPSing and spreading dots so I have a lot of passive healing in place once the barrier fades and I have to start shadow mending. Pre-patch is a great time to have fun in keys and get used to all the new spells and talents Discipline has to offer. If there's anything I missed, let me know in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer it best I can for you. If you enjoyed this video, please consider sharing it with a friend and subscribing to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming Shadowlands videos. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.